Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History of AI podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Alan Avery Peck and Professor Bruce Chilton. And today's live stream is going to be based on their book they co-edited, Targums and Rabbinic Literature. I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below and in the pinned comment just below that. And that being said, thank you both for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Again, thank you both for joining me. So let's do a little recap based under the assumption that some people that are watching today may not have seen the previous podcast episodes that we did on this book, or really for people that have never heard of the Targumim at all. What exactly are the Targumim?
The Targumim are paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible. They were produced in Aramaic, originally speaking for the purpose of Aramaic speakers who needed to have the translation. These paraphrases are especially interesting because they are not straight translations from the Hebrew Bible. Rather, they deliver themselves of interpretations of what the given passages mean. And for that reason, they give us a window into how the Hebrew Bible was understood in their time. The period of composition is very long. It's better than 1,000 years. And so that spans a series of phases of different kinds of interpretation. And it also spans differing uses of Aramaic. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the translation has the practical value that it is written for people whose language is Aramaic rather than Hebrew. However, by the end of the period, Targumim are being produced in Aramaic for people whose first language is not Aramaic. That is, it becomes an academic language for the purposes of exploring interpretation. So in terms of the history of interpretation, it really is a fascinating body of literature.
In what way is the Targumim linked with other rabbinic literature? What is the relationship between the texts?
This is a matter which is still being explored. However, what we can say is that the Targumim are being produced for purposes of interpretation during the same period in which rabbinic literature emerged. And as a result, one of the ways is
Bruce?
Rabbinic literature.
Mm-hmm. You cut out for like 10 seconds there, Bruce.
Yes, I see that. This is, and Alan will know something about this. I have a odd problem with the Wi-Fi sporadically. I've tried various ways of solving the problem, and so far they haven't worked.
Which means that when Bruce goes silent, I'll just have to fill in what he would have been saying at that exact moment, which in this case is that we know that the Targumim are produced by individuals who are within the Jewish community, associated with Jewish practice and life in the centuries in which these documents were created. But at the same time, since the rabbinic literature does not specifically talk about the process or the use of Targumim per se, and since the authors of the Targumim are not always known or are not always associated with known rabbis, the exact connection between the two is not entirely clear.
Who is Yohanan ben Zakkai, and did rabbinic literature and tradition originate from him?
Well, Yohanan ben Zakkai is the individual that the tradition asserts was the founder of the first school of rabbinic studies in the face of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in 70. So the rabbinic literature, the rabbis tell the story of Yohanan, well, I'll tell the story and then we'll see if you have questions or follows. But the story is told that Yohanan, unable to convince the Jewish people to give up this revolt, which was undeniably going to lead to the destruction of the temple, had his students carry him out of Jerusalem in a coffin, was let out of the besieged city by the Roman guards, went to the head of the Roman army, Vespasian, and announced, number one, you're going to be emperor. And we know that because you're the legitimate conqueror of this city. And Vespasian says, what do you want from me? And he says, allow me to set up a school of Torah studies in a place called Yavne. And this is understood by the rabbis as the foundation of their movement. Now, considering the historical reality of the besieging of Jerusalem in the war, the likelihood that Yochanan could have left, that his students and he would have gotten anywhere near Vespasian without being killed, that he would have, in fact, been able to predict Vespasian's future and would have been given the right to, so the whole story, of course, is a story of origins, which, as in so many cases, is created to suggest the ethos and values of the group that create it. We might look at Yochanan, and I can get hate mail for saying this, as a collaborator. He leaves the besieged city, he leaves his own people, and goes to the head of the conquering army and says, I want nothing but peace. And yet that idea is the central idea that emerges in the movement created by Yochanan, if in fact he's a real person who created the movement, which is that what matters is our following of the law, our observance of Torah, our study of Torah, and we need to, unfortunately, live with the terrible political and discriminatory environment in which we live. Trying to fight Rome will lead to death and destruction. Following Torah will lead to eventual salvation. And that was the rabbinic ideology that emerged beginning in the period of this destruction in 70. And it's the ideology that's attributed to Yochanan. So we have no way, of course, there's no contemporaneous evidence for Yochanan's actions. And he's known to us only by this story and by the citations of laws that he stated that are found in the rabbinic literature.
So is there like a huge gap in knowledge about Yochanan ben Zakkai, the lack of, in other words, lack of certainty about the historicity of the person or what we know about his life?
So what we know is that in antiquity in general, biography was never simply the reporting of the facts, unlike today. That biography was a method used to either convey a certain feeling of who a person was and their importance, perhaps their holiness or closeness to God, and a way to make sense of the world for the person telling the story and for whom the stories were intended. My teacher and a teacher and colleague of Bruce as well, Jack Neusner, in the beginning of his career, which is a long time ago, and unfortunately Professor Neusner is no longer with us, began writing what had been, until the early 1960s, a standard biography of Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is that you simply collected every passage stated about him throughout the literature, whether early or late, and sort of wove them together into a narrative. Just as the historical Jesus was normally, the biographies were, if he healed someone in this gospel and a little differently in this gospel, well, he did it twice. Put it all together. What Jack Neusner did, having completed this early and very traditional style of work, was to organize the passages according to the dating of the documents in which they were created and edited. And no surprise, except that 60 or 70 years ago, it was a surprise. He discovered that the earliest stories had the least detail and the least amount of tendentious material, and that as the story grew and as the later documents told the story, the legend, and the book that emerged in this was called Development of a Legend, increasingly told the story of a life which fit into the worldview of the people telling the story. And so it remains today a matter of scholarly dispute whether or not we should trust the documents of early Judaism at face value. If it says someone said something and did something, must we believe it? Do we begin with a position of believing it unless we can prove it is untrue? Or do we begin with an assumption that it's not necessarily historical unless that we can prove it is? But the thing I think we should make clear, and I'm interested to hear what Bruce has to say about this as well, is the fact that what it says in early books is not necessarily what actually happened doesn't mean they have no historical value. The question is what the history is of. My view has always been that the history that emerges is not going to be a history of what Yochanan ben Zakkai did on this date or that date. It's going to be a history of how the authors of the books and the tellers of the tales saw themselves, saw the world in which they lived, made sense of that world, and the lessons they wanted to convey to the people around them, irrelevant whether or not Yochanan actually went to Vespasian.
Mm-hmm.
Relevant that this is how generations of Jews understood the history of their own movement.
I think that's a very sober assessment of the historiographic questions that we face. In kind, it's not dissimilar, actually, when you think of it, from reading, say, Plutarch's Lives or Suetonius on the emperors. In those cases as well, the stories are at the very least selected in order to deliver a particular verdict on the person in question, and also to provide a certain guidance for the life of the reader. Only in the case of rabbinic literature, it's more extreme because the amount of data is smaller and the amount of accompanying presentation is larger. I mean, at the end of the day, you have a skein of teaching attached to names. And so one is attempting to make sense of that. In the case of dealing, for example, with intersections with the development of the Targums, looking at rabbinic literature, we can see that rabbinic literature actually attributes certain Targumim to Jonathan ben Uziel, and yet also at the same time, who was a first century rabbi, and at the same time says that a much later rabbi, Yosef Bar Chia from the 4th century, was also involved in the production of Targumim. I don't think either of those statements is false. That is to say, I think we just happen to have certain famous paraphrasers who are contributing to this tradition. And in principle, I think that Yochanan ben Zakkai is in a similar position. And as Alan says, the tradition is trying to say something about itself, referring to its own founding figure. So it's also fascinating that part of that legend about Yochanan leaving Jerusalem can be compared to what Josephus, the 1st century historian, says about himself. He asserts that he was besieged by the Roman forces, not in Jerusalem, but in his redoubt in Jotapata, and that he finally left in order to hail Vespasian and his son Titus as coming emperors. Now, in the case of Josephus, there's no question this is really the story of a collaborator because he went on to become a propagandist for these two Flavian emperors. That's why he comes to be called Flavius Josephus. And he describes himself proudly circling the walls of Jerusalem and telling people that they really should capitulate because only someone designated by God could conceivably have this much power. The amazing thing, he then tells us how surprised he was when someone threw a rock at him. This to me was the most predictable outcome imaginable. But he survived this to lead a long life. And so you're left with Josephus and Yochanan having associated with them this trope of being besieged, acknowledging the conqueror as being a future emperor. And I think in both cases, the aim is to represent the prophetic authority you're dealing with in these two cases. So I think the part of the value of this material is it reflects what the purpose of a given presentation is.
Yeah. It brings to my mind even the story of Jesus being left by his parents in the temple where he amazingly is teaching and no one can believe how wise this little boy is. First, his parents today would have been found by the Department of Child Welfare and assigned a caseworker. But of course, this is a we don't have to judge whether that actually happened or not to know that this is a kind of trope,
right,
which exists just as the Josephus and the Yochanan ben Zakkai. So when we deal with ancient histories, we're constantly looking for the underlying and commonplace trope that's being used by an author, whether in Josephus's case by himself or in the rabbi's case, in order to make a very particular point that is their point, reflects on their own thinking.
Can you tell us about the Merkava and the controversies with the chariot?
Well, the term Merkabah is commonly used to refer to the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. The term itself means chariot, though there are other forms of this in Hebrew and Aramaic. It might be called Merkabah, it might be called Rekev. But in all such cases, the point of the use of the metaphor at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel is to present the throne of God as being a moving reality, so that Ezekiel's vision, unusually within the Hebrew Bible, does not take place within the land of Israel. It takes place in Babylonia, he says, by the river or the canal called Kibar. So the presence of God there, seated on his throne, needs to be explained by some means. And the explanation is there is infinite mobility involved in the throne of God. And that complicated imagery that begins the book of Ezekiel provides an account of how this kind of mobility is possible. Now, one reason for the complication of that imagery is that it is talking about a new experience of an earlier understanding, namely that of God being enthroned in the heavens. But that picture in itself is, in fact, also related within the Hebrew Bible at earlier stages. So there is also a vision of Moses, of God on the throne, in Exodus 24. There's a very famous vision of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 6 of that book. And the Isaiah vision is clearly developed within what we have in the book of Ezekiel. And there's also a startling image of the throne in the book of Zechariah. So what's fascinating about the entire tradition of the vision of God is that there's a connection among these traditions of what the reality of God is, But that tradition doesn't cause simple, static repetition of what was there beforehand. Quite the contrary, there's a mix of earlier tradition with current experience and the circumstances of which the visionary is aware, so that each example of the Merkabah itself becomes a different type of view of how it is that God can become accessible. When we're dealing with how that text is then incorporated within the Targumim, what we can see is that Ezekiel's vision in the Targum is not quite the same as it is in the Hebrew. Similarly, Isaiah's vision goes through really quite a dramatic change. And this is also true of the handling of the Zechariah and Exodus texts. So in these cases, what we can see, I think, is that the Merkabah texts are also handbooks for understanding in differing time of how God can be encountered.
What does Vitosefta say about the dove, and how is it similar and different from the baptism of Jesus seen in the Gospels?
Oh gosh, Bruce, do you have a response to this?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the story in the Tosefta when Yochanan ben Zakkai is traveling, and his disciple asks him about the Merkabah. And Yochanan tells him, you know very well that this cannot be done except with the person whose learning is in his hand. So finally, after some discussion, the disciple enters into a understanding of the Merkabah, and indeed they are in fact surrounded by some of the reality of the Merkabah, including fiery angels. Fiery angels, by the way, are a typical motif of what's called Merkabah mysticism that emerges at a fairly early stage, both in the Targumim and in rabbinic literature. So the issue of how this relates to John the Baptist is that John the Baptist's preaching involves an assertion that the Spirit of God is about to be disclosed. When you read the descriptions of John the Baptist within the Gospels, it is tempting to see him only in terms of the periodized relationship between himself and Jesus. But when he refers to one who is greater than he, baptizing in fire, the initial referent of that, as has been acknowledged for some time, is God himself baptizing with fire. So this picture of the fiery presence of God is something that's shared between the imagery attributed to John the Baptist and the way in which the Merkabah is understood elsewhere.
Which is, of course, one of the main goals of the book that we're talking about that's led us to be together here, which is to exemplify by introducing the various documents of the Targumim and of the rabbinic literature. There's either specific or more general relationship to the study of the New Testament, and to demonstrate what amounts to the need for anyone who wishes accurately and fully to understand what's going on in the New Testament, as in the case that Bruce just explained, what's going on in the contemporaneous literature of Judaism.
Can you tell us about the remarkable parallel between 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4 with 1 Enoch?
Well, I think it's remarkable in the sense that Paul, in that case, is referring to his own experience and refers to himself as being snatched up into the third heaven. And that picture, of course, is also the way in which the experience of Enoch is described within the Enochic tradition. Now, that whole tradition itself represents extraordinary creativity. And this is an element that I think always needs to be borne in mind. The Hebrew Bible tells us very little about Enoch. I mean, it tells us in the book of Genesis that Enoch walked with God and he was not. That's the end of the story. But in the world of interpretation, that apparent lack of a continuation of the story is an invitation to look further. And so there grew out of that, probably from a rather early stage. Usually, the earliest parts of the Book of Enoch are attributed to the 3rd century before the Common Era. It is a remarkably ancient tradition. And so you begin to get the idea that the reason Enoch was no longer seen by his contemporaries was that he was actually given a tour of heaven. And Enochic tradition, not only the first book of Enoch, but second and third, and indeed subsequent traditions, build on this sense of what Enoch saw. That is what also the person familiar with his tradition can see as being the reality of God. And when you come to the description of the divine throne within Enoch, what you can see is that the elements I referred to earlier from Exodus, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah are being woven together, and they're all woven together within a visionary tradition according to which the person having the experience, the seer, describes himself as being lifted into heaven. That's what Paul says happened in his case. It is also what the author of the Apocalypse, John of Patmos, says occurs to him. That is, the beginning of the Apocalypse consists of Jesus as the Son of Man coming to John of Patmos, telling him to write letters to the 7 churches. The description of Jesus as the Son of Man in those opening chapters of the Apocalypse matches really pretty well much of the description that appears in the book of Ezekiel and also in the book of Daniel. But then, after that opening sequence of letters, the Apocalypse changes its point of view and describes John of Patmos doing what Enoch did. That is, entering up through a gateway and into heaven, and there perceiving what's described in the bulk of the book. So what this is showing us is that the Merkabah tradition finds itself reflected in a variety of ways within the New Testament. And unless one is aware of the richness of this tradition, all of this must appear, as people have frequently read the Apocalypse, as being somehow aberrant, somehow unusual. I mean, a typical attack on the Apocalypse is to ask the question, is this man on drugs? You know, is he somehow just dealing with some paranormal experience? In fact, of all the interpreters who dealt with this way, I think the most prominent, surprisingly, is D.H. Lawrence, who wrote an entire book on the Apocalypse, explaining to his own satisfaction anyway, what an absurd and deliberately ridiculous book the Apocalypse was. It's sort of the high point of a rationalizing, dismissive understanding of any kind of biblical book. But if one sees the Apocalypse like that section of Paul that refers to Paul's own experience as being a part of a wider tradition in which the Merkabah is understood to be a guide to how you might perceive God, which you can use in order to perceive God yourself, then I think we find their center of gravity and we understand what's going on within them.
Do you think that Paul might have known First Enoch or something similar or something connected to it that may have inspired some of the things that he was saying, including what I was just asking you about?
I think it is plausible. I would prefer to begin with elements that we can be reasonably secure Paul was aware of. He clearly knows the scriptures of Israel in the Septuagint, in the current Greek translation of the scriptures of Israel, which was available. It is true that in his time, the text of the Septuagint itself was still in a period of formation. It had not yet been fixated. And yet, if we look at the way in which Paul quotes the scriptures of Israel, we see it corresponds not completely, but very closely to what we have in the case of the Septuagint. And this makes perfect sense because he's writing to people whom he also assumes are familiar with the Septuagint. And we can see this if you look at a letter, for example, the letter to the Galatians. Any reader today, I think, working through Galatians would very quickly find one's eye going down to the footnotes, asking, wait, what are these scriptural citations doing here? And how do they relate to one another? We have to work at that question. The people who initially heard the letter to the Galatians were expected to follow that along on the assumption that they had heard these scriptures before and were prepared to hear them again. So I think I would give preference to the Septuagint. As it turns out, there are cases where Paul doesn't give us at all straight insight into the Septuagint as we know it now, but where there are crossovers to the Targumim that we've been referring to, and sometimes to the Hebrew text. So I think for those reasons, we should credit him with having an awareness of other traditions in his own time. And indeed, I think First Enoch might have been among them, but I'm not aware within Paul of any moment when I could say that there is a clear example of his quotation of First Enoch.
So what do we know about the earliest documents of the Amorim?
Well, which of those would you say were the earliest, Alan?
Well, probably the early Amoraic Midrashim. But in other words, the question of what do we know about? What we know about is that we have the documents themselves, culminating in the Babylonian Talmud. We have little information regarding how these documents were formulated, what the form of the materials they contain was before they were formulated, how they were transmitted. So, for instance, any of our audience who's familiar with the Talmud, for instance, will note that it cites traditions that go way back to the period while the temple still stood, all the way up until the 4th and 5th centuries, maybe early 6th centuries. But how these materials, what form they had before someone collected them and put them together in the book before us is not at all clear. I have done an analysis of some small sections of the Talmud, which suggests that the various types of Talmudic materials, that is, interpretation versus citation of other sources, different modes of argumentation, exist in the same percentages from early to later periods, which suggests that somehow what the book looks like overall was put together by the guy at the end. generally, and these are referred to as Savoraim, group of the latest rabbis who are understood to have collected the traditions and formed the text. So if we find the same amount of, say, identification of the biblical source of a law in early Amoraim and later Amoraim, is it because someone at the beginning knew, hey, this is what we're really interested in? Or is it because someone at the end said, this is what we're interested in, and picked the same percentages of material? There have been attempts. My friend Marty Jaffe wrote a very wonderful book about the oral origins or the potential oral origins of the tradition. And even there, all that can be said is that it is possible that some material in some unknown ways were preserved orally, whether they were created orally or once they were done, they were memorized is entirely unclear. So we have, and in this regard, I think looking at the Gospels, the same problem. We can identify certain sources, but exactly who and how put these things together, in what format, and even in what process or years, very unclear. So, and for this reason, again, going back to the historical question that we asked earlier in this podcast of how historical is anything? What we certainly know is that in a certain year, a certain midrashic text was formalized, representing the ideology, the desires to express something of those who put it together. Whether we can go back and say, and the citation of someone who lived 200 years earlier that is found in this book accurately represents the ideology of that person, unclear. We don't know, right? Not everything that was said was preserved. Not everything that was said was preserved accurately. The choices of later redactors and the way in which later redactors put materials together shaped the ultimate meaning.
What is the Talmud of the land of Israel?
So there are two different compilations known by the title Talmud. The title Talmud in general refers to an exegetical work that focuses on the earlier Mishnah. So Talmud is composed of the Mishnah, the earliest product of Rabbinic Judaism, formulated in around the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century after the Common Era, which is then commented on by rabbis called Amoraim. Their commentary is called Gemara. So Mishnah, the earlier document, plus Gemara, the document that comments on the Mishnah, put them together, and you've got what is known as Talmud. The rabbis of the land of Israel produced a document which became known as the Talmud of the land of Israel. It's often referred to as either Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which is not an accurate name because there's no connection of the Talmud of the land of Israel to Jerusalem in particular. It was for many years known in English as the Palestinian Talmud, which is entirely confusing because it's related neither to the Palestinian people nor to what the Romans called the land of Israel, Palestine per se. And so many of us use the title Talmud of the land of Israel to designate this Talmud. As the center of Jewish life increasingly was in Babylonia, the rabbis of Babylonia produced their own independent Talmud. Both Talmuds cite people from each location. the Talmud of Babylonia, it often refers to land of Israel rabbis. It says when Rabbi such and so came, he taught this. The Talmud of Babylonia, called Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud, tends to assert its own authority over and the higher level of authority of rabbis of Babylonia. And in later Judaism, the Babylonians, oddly, although to the extent that Judaism has been a diaspora religion, was a diaspora religion for many, many years, it is the Babylonian Talmud, completed probably 100 to 150 years later than the Jerusalem Talmud, which became the more authoritative basis for later Jewish law. And the Talmud of the two that has been the subject much more completely both of study within rabbinical academies and yeshiva settings and religious settings, and also in the academy. So the Babylonian Talmud, generally when people refer to the Talmud, they mean the Bavli and not the Yerushalmi.
Can you tell us about some of the passages in the New Testament that parallel with the Talmud of the land of Israel?
Well, I don't know if I would say that parallel the Talmud of the land of Israel per se, but I think there are many passages that reflect teachings that appear in the Talmuds or in Jewish law or Jewish lore more generally. And in some cases, matters of legal issues that are found in the New Testament. Jesus's proclamation regarding divorce is a dispute found in the Mishnah and discussed in the Talmud between the houses of Hillel and Shammai regarding the terms for divorce. Jesus's statement that one should only divorce for a matter of sexual impropriety is a common rabbinic view of his age. Other, important things, the question of healing on the Sabbath relates to many, many Talmudic passages regarding the question of what can and cannot be done on the Sabbath, healing being sometimes a debatable question. If it is for the purpose of saving a life, there is no question that the rabbis hold that healing is not only appropriate but required. Life or the saving of life overcomes any other prohibition of Jewish law. But even, Jesus heals people who are not in imminent danger of death. And the Talmud also makes room for healing in cases in which, right, you might do something sort of a little bit around the side. Well, if you rub a little something on yourself, because it feels good, not necessarily to heal it, then it's okay on the Sabbath, even if the side effect is to heal. So there are many such cases. I'm talking and trying to think at the same time. Bruce will be thinking of other examples while I'm talking. But even passages, the famous what is the most important law passage in which Jesus indicates do unto others or love your neighbor as yourself. This is a commonplace ideology that is expressed in the Talmud. And the final one that I'll think of is we always have a sense, of course, that Jesus put human relations and ethics before the niceties of the law. So Jesus says, if you're offering a sacrifice and remember that you owe your brother something, he says, go and pay the debt. And he says, but then go and offer the sacrifice too. And that, of course, is right at the heart of the rabbinic treatment of ritual law versus ethical law. A sacrifice of forgiveness in the temple is not effective unless you have first corrected the matter that you are trying to ritually cleanse yourself of. So there are many, many, many cases of this sort, which generally situate Jesus either within the sort of mainstream of the legal thinking found in the Talmud, or that suggest that positions he has taken or expresses would not have been unknown within the context of a rabbinic Judaism that in which debate over law and disagreement of how to follow the law or what the law requires, of course, is one of the main hallmarks of the whole system. So, and it's in this regard, again, that I think the recognition of the importance of studying all of these literatures in order to get a better picture of Jesus, who was not the only ancient Jew who, for instance, was nice to women, or not the only ancient Jew who thought that ethical treatment of one's neighbor came before ritualism, not the only ancient Jew who preached the message of peace, and other areas like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all of those are excellent examples, and I think they function in two ways. One way is that they help when we are attempting, as Alan suggests, to contextualize teachings attributed to Jesus and see that, in fact, they map very well on what we can understand of how such disputes were emerging within Judaism when the temple still stood, and then later with the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism. That by itself is, I think, a vitally important finding. So that I think that New Testament scholars should routinely be aware of where there are demonstrable intersections between the New Testament and the Targumim and rabbinic literature. Now, when I say intersection, I don't mean, I want to stress this, I don't mean that these are cases where somehow the New Testament is quoting rabbinic literature, nor am I saying the reverse of that. We can talk about intersections without speaking of causation, because very often causation lies beyond our capacity to tell at this remove in history. But we can clearly understand when worlds of discourse are intersecting with one another, and it's clear that the materials attributed to Jesus very frequently intersect extremely well with materials in Rabbinica, including the Targumim. But having said that, I think the other vitally important factor to bear in mind is that the unfolding of rabbinic literature, as Alan has just explained us, is a case that we have where we can actually see the emergence of an oral tradition into a written composition with internal interpretation feeding that entire process. The very fact that Talmud, whether Land of Israel or Bavli, that Talmud involves commentary on Mishnah, that is not commentary on scripture per se, but on Mishnah. The tradition is commenting and developing itself. And one of the ways that it's doing that is to explore places where there are discrepancies, there are disagreements. Sometimes those disagreements are attributed to one school of thought and another. Sometimes they emerge within schools. And isn't it interesting that we have something very similar going on within the New Testament? That is, the teaching attributed to Jesus is not always the same from gospel to gospel. There are moments of discrepancy which go beyond the sort of routine remark that memories of the same event can vary. Yes, of course, memories can vary, but it's something more than that. There's also an active process of interpretation necessitated when you develop an oral tradition and then come to the moment where it comes to be crystallized in writing. That is a fascinating process. We don't have a great deal of evidence for understanding how that occurred, apart from rabbinic literature. So for me, part of the value of this kind of study is the process by which the material is developed, as well as the particular assertions which are being made within it.
So now I'm going to shift to super chat questions. We got about 3 of them. Well, the first one's not a question, but a statement. El Caracca, thank you for your super chat. I appreciate your hard work, Jacob. Thanks for having a platform that we can learn from awesome men like this. Keep it up. Watching from Dayton, Nevada. Well, thank you, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. How important is Rashi commentary to Jews today? Every Tanakh seems to have him. I was a little shocked to see a rabbi kind of throw him under the bus because of whatever it was. This also included the Babylonian Talmud.
Rashi remains centrally important for 2 reasons. Number one, we are the heirs to an incredible tradition of interpretation of Scripture, beginning within the rabbinic literature and the rabbinic midrashim and continuing throughout the medieval period, and developed today by rabbis and scholars who continue to pursue both the critical meaning of the text of Scripture and to pursue a sense of what the text can mean for us. And in thinking about these matters, commentators like Rashi and the whole range of medieval biblical commentaries, these guys were very incisive and smart, and they knew the literature and put things together in ways that that we might not see. And so recourse to these traditions can give us an appreciation for the text and an understanding of the text and an ability to delve into the text that just reading it on our own we wouldn't have. Now, at the same time, we have to be clear that these interpretations were the product of a day and age that had neither the critical knowledge of the text that we have, nor the scientific knowledge of medicine and physics and other matters that we have, that in many regards lived in a world in which, whether of spirituality and a sense of the closest to the divine, that made interpretations that we would immediately say, that can't be. I read in the Talmud really from week to week, medical treatments and explanations of what happened that depend on theories of anything from, how babies gestate and are born to the impact of eating certain plants on one's health, which we just know are not correct. So I would never throw Rashi under the bus, as our questioner put it. I might say to a class of either college students or adult learners, or if I were speaking in a synagogue, Rashi proposes X, which in Rashi's day and in Rashi's worldview made a lot of sense. We likely don't see it that way. Doesn't make Rashi not a worthwhile commentator. It just means we have to understand how we're using him. And of course, the same thing with any ancient text today, and including the Talmud. So I would hope that we can treat ancient literatures with respect. Does not mean to accept everything they say or to believe everything they say is right, but it also doesn't help if this were what happened, and I think it would be regrettable to simply say, well, gee, Rashi is dumb or didn't know things. I suspect that Rashi was smarter than the smartest of us.
S. Middle, thank you for your super chat. Have you heard of any ancient Hellenistic commentaries on Greek works with similar odd prophetic or apophenia interpretations like Talmud and Pesharim?
So it looks like Bruce is maybe frozen. So I'm going to do my best to. Oh, Bruce, this is a good one for you on ancient
I just
Hellenistic.
moved. Yes, right. I think that there are cases where we can see this kind of work going on in Greek, but let me take the Pesharim comment first. The Pesharim, which mostly are instanced from Qumran, do give us very assiduous commentary on individual words, and they're systematic. In fact, the Pesharim are more systematic as commentary than Midrash is. It's a fascinatingly meticulous way of going about the text. At the same time, the Pesharim represent the meaning of the text for all this work as being allegorical. So the fact that it's meticulous doesn't make it point by point a good exegesis of the original texts. However, that method, as the questioner asked about, that method of looking into the etymological meaning of words and relating that to what's alleged to be the meaning of the text, one can also see in the work of Philo of Alexandria. And Philo represents a mixed tradition. He is both very concerned with the issue of the authority of Moses, and at the same time, he's devoted to the insights of Plato. So for Philo, you can't understand Moses without Plato, and you can't understand Plato without Moses. He's just an extraordinary interpreter. Sometimes he is extremely devoted to etymologies. These etymologies are by no means always convincing. And indeed, his overall stance was one that was embraced within Christianity, but not within the Judaism which was his home. That is, we are aware of most of the textual tradition of Philo as a result of its being held on to within Christian interpretation, because, of course, it delighted in this combination of individual commentary on words and allegorical exegesis. In this regard, Philo was actually developing in a way that was suited to the way in which both Plato and Aristotle were being understood in Philo's time. That is, late first century BCE and first century CE. And that was a continuing tradition. One can see that very much at home within Greek interpretation as it thrived during the period of Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism. I mean, finally, it gives us commentators such as Augustine, who also combines this emphasis upon etymological and meticulously linguistic comments with allegorical exegesis. So I think that one can find crossovers in regard to the devotion to individual words as unlocking the meaning. The issue is how you conceive of that meaning. So in the case of Midrash within rabbinic literature, there's a conviction that one is going to discover meaning that accords with the halakha as taught by the rabbis. If you take the same text, say in Augustine, who is operating in much the same period as some of the Amoraim, he will be arguing how it is that this text is in fact a representation of Christ. So a superficially comparable method can lead to globally different results.
Yeah. I think it's important for our listeners to understand there has been some amount of work done on the similarity in hermeneutical principles and legal ideologies between what's found in the rabbinic literature, Midrashim in particular, and the Talmudic literature. But certainly in terms of the Talmud and its legal assessment and mode of dialectical discussion, there is no known parallel or documents that look the same. So we can identify, and increasingly scholars have found a close connection between certain legal approaches, hermeneutical approaches, and the Persian setting of the Babylonian Talmud, for instance. And yet the way the document looks and unfolds and is really without parallel.
Mm-hmm. This, I think, is one of the most interesting factors if we stand back and look at the consideration, say, of Targums and rabbinic literature, and look at the form of what we're dealing with, and we combine that with a consideration of how other literatures have developed. There's nothing quite like the Qumran scrolls. Various kinds of work have been done about the scrolls of Qumran and the New Testament and the development of early rabbinic literature. And yet the fact is that structurally speaking, something like the Manual of Discipline, the Pesharim, the Hodayot, they're really unlike what we find elsewhere when you look at them structurally. Similarly, of course, the New Testament is what is there quite like this? These movements are producing distinctive literatures in themselves, which I think is something we need to bear in mind when we compare them. That is, we shouldn't, because they are unique in their structure, we can't expect them to be easily isomorphic when they are talking about something that might be compared.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. What about the Zohar and the Kabbalah? It seems to come from out of nowhere. Did those texts exist during the First and Second Temple periods?
No, these texts did not exist during the First and Second Temple periods. The Zohar and Kabbalah are medieval productions. They certainly don't come out of nowhere, which is, we've already talked about Merkavah and other kinds of mysticism, ideas of journeys to the divine, ideas of modes of connection to the divine, of mystical ways of coming to know God. But the foundational ideology of the Kabbalah, that the way the earth exists was the result of a cosmic accident in which the vessels that were to hold the divine light shattered, really is a product of a life experience of certain Jews who found in this image a way to make sense of their own power to help correct the world, in which the performance of mitzvot was not simply a way of being an ethical and good person, and if I do it, God will like me and things will be better, but rather when I perform a mitzvah, I am physically reuniting God and recreating the order of the cosmos the way in which it was supposed to be. Now, for someone who is in a terrible social, economic, political position with no apparent way out, this kind of mystical thinking offered a mode of making sense of the world or of one's place in the world and a hope for a certain future which otherwise didn't exist. But these are developments ultimately cited in the names of earlier rabbis and teachers, as is often the case with later literatures, but they are products of the medieval period and have their own unique social and religious setting beyond the Talmud and Rabbinism.
Yeah, I think that's a very good distinction between the Merkabah traditions of an early period and the Hekhalot material of a middle period, and then finally Zohar and what comes to be called the Kabbalah. I think another possible element of this is the widespread impact of the movement we call Gnosticism from the 4th century and later. That is, that period when it was widely felt, and not only in the Greco-Roman world, but also in the Persian world, widely felt that the world as we know it is damaged by a flaw, and the flaw somehow needs rectification that can only come about as a result of the insight of revelation. This is at one and the same time a sophisticated analysis and one that demands the development of a spiritual elite capable of standing up to the difficulty. And one can see examples of that kind of thought in the Persian world, in the case of the prophet called Mane, in the development of Gnosticism, as I say, in the Christian world, and then also in what's happening with the development of the Kabbalah. I think also myself that the emergence of the Quran is to some extent a reflection of an engagement with the conviction of living in a deeply disrupted world, disrupted not only socially, but in a cosmogonic sense. It's a very, very interesting period. But I completely agree that we should be aware that this is a different period from the simple assertion of the Merkabah, which we can see at an earlier stage.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for another super chat. One last one. Is Lilith in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls? A lot of controversy between a demon or an owl.
I'll add, this is a better question for Bruce, but to my knowledge, Lilith does not appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's about the extent of what I can say about this.
Yeah, I think the remark the question makes is an astute one. I think that the issue is whether Lilith is a figure, is a demonic persona, or whether we're dealing rather with simple imagery. I think that within the Hebrew Bible, Lilith can refer to this devastation, which some people have, I think, referred to, as it were, the screeching of an owl. And that could be reflected within the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the persona, the Lilith persona, very much belongs to what we were just talking about, to the idea of there being cosmogonic disruption. Lilith emerges, I think, as one of those disruptors, but within the Byzantine period and then going into the medieval period.
So I'd like to remind everybody real quick before we close, the link to purchase Targums and Rabbinic literature is in the description below and in the pinned comment. With that being said, Alan and Bruce, thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Jacob. Pleasure being here.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.